There is a photograph of a man standing on an airport tarmac, and in it, he still looks like the most powerful person in his country. 18 months later, he will be dead, stripped of his throne, buried in a borrowed grave in a foreign capital because his own nation refused to take his body back. In between those two moments, his family will lose almost everything a family can lose. This is what happened to them. To understand how far the Pahlavis fell, you have to understand how strange their rise was in the first place. This and an ancient royal line. It wasn't centuries of inherited legitimacy. It was, in a very real sense, invented in a single generation by a soldier who crowned himself with his own hands. His name was Reza Khan, and he was born in 1878 into a modest military family in the mountains of northern Iran. He joined the Persian Cossack Brigade as a young man and rose through its ranks with a speed that surprised the officers around him. By 1921, Iran was a country coming apart. The ruling Qajar dynasty, which had held the throne since the late 1700s, was weak and broke, and its last king spent most of his time in Europe while foreign powers carved up the country's resources between them. Reza Khan, the opening. In February of that year, he marched his brigade into Tehran and seized control of the government. For a few years he worked from the shadows, first as Minister of War, then as Prime Minister. But by 1925, Iran's parliament formally removed the last Qajar monarch, and a specially convened assembly declared Reza Khan the new Shah. He took the surname Pahlavi, a name pulled from Iran's pre-Islamic past, a deliberate attempt to link his brand new dynasty to the grandeur of ancient Persia. And here's the detail that tells you everything about how this monarchy began. There was no coronation by any religious authority, no centuries-old ritual. Reza Shah simply picked up a crown that had been made for the occasion and placed it on his own head. A dynasty that hadn't existed a few years earlier had just declared itself equal to empires that were thousands of years old. He ruled as an iron-fisted modernizer for the next 16 years, building railways, curbing the power of tribal chiefs and the clergy, and pushing through reforms that included expanding women's access to education. He was, in many ways, chasing the same project Ataturk had pursued next door in Turkey, trying to drag a traditional society into the industrial age through sheer force of will. He confiscated enormous amounts of land, reportedly becoming one of the largest landowners in the country himself in the process, built the country's first modern university, and pushed through reforms curbing traditional dress and clerical courts. But that same forcefulness made him enemies everywhere at once. The clergy resented the attack on religious authority. The tribes resented losing their autonomy. And by the late 1930s, Britain, which had once found him a useful, stabilizing figure, grew increasingly nervous as he began cultivating economic and diplomatic ties with Nazi Germany. When the Second World War broke out and that relationship with Berlin deepened, Britain and the Soviet Union simply invaded. In September of 1941, under direct pressure from the Allies, Reza Shah abdicated in favor of his 21-year-old son and was shipped into exile, eventually landing in Johannesburg, South Africa. He never saw Iran again. He died there in 1944, reportedly of a heart attack, an unhappy and increasingly reclusive man who had spent his final years asking the British in vain to let him move somewhere closer to home. That 21-year-old son, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, inherited a throne during a foreign military occupation, and for over a decade he ruled more as a figurehead than a king. Real power sat with parliament and with a fiery, wildly popular nationalist prime minister named Mohammad Mossadegh, who in 1951 did something that terrified London. He nationalized Iran's oil industry, ending decades of one-sided profit for the British-run Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, the company that would later become BP. Britain wanted Mossadegh gone, and Washington, gripped by Cold War paranoia about Soviet influence, eventually agreed to help. In August of 1953, the American and British intelligence services launched a coup, and it very nearly failed. The first attempt collapsed when Mossadegh got wind of it, and the young Shah panicked and briefly fled the country. But the CIA officer running the operation on the ground, Kermit Roosevelt, a grandson of Theodore Roosevelt, ignored orders from his own headquarters to stand down and pushed forward anyway, organizing new demonstrations and rallying military units loyal to the crown. After days of street fighting that left, by most estimates, somewhere around 300 people dead, Mossadegh's government fell, and the Shah returned to Tehran in triumph. That moment shaped everything that came after. From then on, the Shah understood, whether he said it aloud or not, that his throne didn't rest on the will of his own people. It rested on the backing of Washington and London. And what happens to a king who knows, deep down, that his own subjects didn't put him back on the throne, that a foreign intelligence officer did? For the next quarter century, the answer to that question would define almost everything he did. For the next 26 years, he ruled as an absolute monarch, propped up by American aid and increasingly policed by a secret intelligence service called Savak, whose reputation for brutality became one of the defining features of his reign. He launched a sweeping reform program in the 1960s that on paper looked progressive: land redistribution, expanded voting rights for women, literacy campaigns. But in practice it alienated nearly every group in the country at once. The clergy, led by a cleric named Ruhollah Khomeini, saw the reforms as an attack on religious authority. Landowners lost their estates. The left saw the whole program as a Western-backed distraction from real democracy. Khomeini was arrested and then exiled, and he spent the next 15 years abroad, first in Iraq and then in France, smuggling sermons into Iran on cassette tapes that were copied and panned to hand across the country. Anyone who pushed back too hard against any of it risked running into Savak, the Shah's intelligence service, whose interrogation methods became one of the defining fears of the era and helped turn what might have remained scattered political grievances into something closer to a unified national rage. Throughout 1978, that rage found a rhythm. In January, a government-linked newspaper printed an article insulting Khomeini, triggering deadly riots in the holy city of Qom. Under the Shia mourning tradition, memorial gatherings were held 40 days later, and those gatherings turned into fresh protests, which were met with fresh violence, which produced new deaths to mourn 40 days after that. The cycle repeated itself across the country for most of the year, each round of it larger than the last, until by autumn, workers in the oil industry had joined a nationwide strike that brought the country's economy to a standstill. Meanwhile, the Shah poured the country's oil wealth into an image of himself as a great modernizer. In 1971, he staged an extravagant, multi-day celebration at the ancient ruins of Persepolis, marking 2,500 years of the Persian monarchy, with food reportedly flown in from Paris and heads of state dining under air-conditioned tents pitched in the middle of the desert. Estimates of what it cost vary wildly. Some accounts put it in the tens of millions of dollars, others considerably higher. But whatever the true number, for many ordinary Iranians living in poverty a short drive away, it looked like exactly what it was: a monarchy throwing one of the most expensive parties in modern history in a country plenty of people still didn't have running water. How do you convince a nation you're building its future while spending a fortune celebrating your own past? The Shah never really answered that question, and the people watching from outside the tents eventually answered it for him. By the mid-1970s, the cracks were widening faster than the regime could paper over them. A surge in global oil prices in the early part of the decade had quadrupled Iran's revenues almost overnight. And that flood of money drove inflation that crushed the urban poor, even as new wealth built luxury hotels next to slums with no running water. Rural families migrated into Tehran by the hundreds of thousands looking for work, and many of them ended up in exactly those slums, close enough to the new construction to see it every day, but with none of the benefit trickling down to them. Reports at the time pointed to a royal circle, including a family-controlled charitable foundation, that had accumulated enormous private holdings, though the exact scale of that wealth remains disputed to this day and should be treated as an estimate rather than a fixed figure. Protest and repression fed each other in a grim cycle throughout 1978, culminating in September of that year when troops opened fire on demonstrators in Tehran's Jaleh Square, an event that came to be known as Black Friday, killing dozens. By autumn, a nationwide strike had brought the country to a standstill. So on January the 6th, 1979, the Shah boarded a plane and told reporters he was leaving for a short vacation. He never came back. What happened to his family afterward wasn't simply a change of government. It was closer to an annihilation, and it unfolded in stages, each one crueler than the last. The Shah spent his final year and a half as a man nobody wanted to host for long. He landed first in Aswan, Egypt, where President Anwar Sadat welcomed him warmly, then moved on to Morocco, where King Hassan offered temporary shelter, then to the Bahamas, then to Mexico. At every stop, the pattern repeated itself with almost mechanical precision. A government would offer sanctuary, grow nervous within weeks about provoking the new revolutionary regime in Tehran, and quietly ask him to move on to somewhere else. Think about that for. This was a man who, a year earlier, had commanded one of the most powerful militaries in the Middle East and controlled a share of the world's oil supply large enough to worry Washington and Moscow alike. And now he was something closer to an unwanted house guest, shuffled from country to country, because nobody wanted the diplomatic headache of keeping him around. Back home, the country he'd ruled was tearing down every trace of him. Ayatollah Khomeini returned to Tehran on February 1979 to crowds in the millions, and within days revolutionary courts were executing former generals and officials, in some cases after trials that reportedly lasted less than an hour with no defense counsel present. Amir Abbas Havida, who had served as the Shah's prime minister for 13 years, was among them, tried and executed by firing squad that spring. Reports from the period suggest hundreds of former officials, military officers, and Savak agents met similar fates in those early months. The family's palaces were seized and had eventually turned into public museums, presented visitors as monuments to what the new government called the excesses of the fallen monarchy. The Shah, it turned out, had been secretly battling cancer for years, a diagnosis kept hidden from almost everyone, including much of his own government. By late 1979, he urgently needed specialized treatment, and in October, President Jimmy Carter reluctantly allowed him into the United States for medical care. It was a decision with enormous consequences. In Tehran, his admission into America was read as proof that Washington was plotting to reinstall him, just as it had in 1953. On November the 4th, revolutionary students stormed the American embassy and took more than 50 hostages, an event that would stretch on for 444 days and permanently poison relations between the two countries. Under mounting pressure, the Shah was moved out of the United States to Panama and then, in March of 1980, to Egypt, where President Anwar Sadat, one of the very few world leaders who stayed loyal to him until the end, took him in one last time. He was gravely ill by then. Surgeons in Cairo removed his cancer-ridden spleen, but the infections that followed proved too much. On July the 27th, 1980, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi died in a military hospital on the banks of the Nile. He was 60 years old. Sadat gave him a state funeral, but almost no foreign heads of state attended. Richard Nixon came as a private citizen. The sitting American president sent no representative at all. A man who had once dined with presidents and prime ministers was buried in near silence. What was left behind was his widow, Empress Farah, 41 years old, in a foreign country, with 4 children and a family name that had gone from the most powerful in Iran to a symbol of everything the revolution had risen up against. She and the children stayed on in Egypt for a while under Sadat's protection. But after his assassination in October of 1981, that safety net effectively disappeared. The following year, President Ronald Reagan extended an invitation for the family to settle in the United States, and they eventually put down roots in the Washington, D.C. suburbs and in Connecticut. Farah spent much of the following decade trying to hold the family together while also working to preserve some version of her husband's legacy, giving interviews, engaging with UNESCO on cultural and humanitarian projects, and quietly supporting an Iranian diaspora community by then numbered in the hundreds of thousands scattered across the United States and Europe. From the outside, it looked like a dignified second act. From the inside, according to those close to the family, the weight of everything that had happened never really lifted. And here is where the story stops being about politics and becomes something much more personal. Because over the next 3 decades, the family would lose member after member, not to old age, but to violence and to a grief that never really let go of them. The first blow landed less than a year after the revolution, and it fell on the Shah's twin sister, Princess Ashraf Pahlavi, a fiercely political woman who during the monarchy had represented Iran at the United Nations and wielded real behind-the-scenes influence. Her son, Shahryar Shafiq, was a captain in the Imperial Iranian Navy, one of the only members of the family to build a military career of his own. He'd stayed in Iran fighting the revolutionaries for months after the Shah fled, before finally escaping in early 1979 and settling in Paris to organize resistance from abroad. On December 7, 1979, he was walking down a quiet street just outside his mother's Paris apartment when a masked gunman approached from behind and shot him twice in the head. He was 34 years old. He died on the pavement. An Iranian government newspaper would later publish an obituary praising his killer as a martyr. And the assassination is widely regarded as the first in a long line of killings the Islamic Republic carried out against opponents living abroad in the years that followed. The next loss took over 20 years to arrive, but when it did, it fell on the youngest of the Shah's 4 children, a princess named Leila. She had been just 9 years old when the family fled Iran, too young to really understand what was happening, but old enough to feel everything familiar disappear at once. She grew up between Connecticut and Paris, studied literature and philosophy at Brown University, and by outward appearances was a poised, cosmopolitan young woman, reportedly fluent in Persian and French, with a working command of other languages besides. On paper, she had every advantage a person could ask for. But according to family and press accounts, she struggled for years with severe depression, an eating disorder, and a dependence on prescription medication that deepened over time. She never married, and she spent much of her adult life moving between hotel rooms in London and Paris, increasingly withdrawn from the world around her. On June 10, 2001, Leila Pahlavi was found dead in her room at the Leonard Hotel in London. She was 31. An autopsy reportedly found more than 5 times a lethal dose of a barbiturate in her system, and authorities ruled the death a probable suicide. She was buried quietly in a Paris cemetery near her maternal grandmother, with no state ceremony and no flag, a princess laid to rest thousands of miles from the country where she had been born. The family had barely absorbed that loss when, almost exactly a decade later, it happened again, this time to Leila's older brother, Alireza. He had been 12 when the family left Iran, and he grew into a serious intellectual young man, studying at Princeton and later pursuing graduate work at Columbia and Harvard focused on ancient Iranian history and language. Those close to the family have said that after Leila's death, something in him changed permanently, that the loss of his father as a teenager and then his sister in his 30s left a weight he never fully set down. He had a partner, Raha Daidavar, and the couple was expecting their first child together. On January 4, 2011, Alireza Pahlavi was found dead in his Boston apartment from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. He was 44. His daughter was born 6 months later and was given the name Ariana Leila, after the aunt she would never meet. Ashraf herself lived on for years after burying her son, dividing her time between homes in Paris, New York, and Monte Carlo, remaining loudly, unapologetically political, even as most of her generation faded from view. She had once been painted by Andy Warhol, immortalized with bright red lips and jet black hair at the height of her influence. And in exile, she reportedly kept insisting, until she was very old, that the monarchy still lived somewhere in the blood of the Iranian people. She died in 2016, at 96, having outlived her twin brother by 36 years and her son by 37. By then, Empress Farah had buried her husband, her youngest daughter, and her younger son. She was in her early 70s. Foreign press at the time spoke of a Pahlavi curse, a family that had never recovered from losing everything at once. There's truth in that framing, but it isn't the whole story, because while grief was quietly consuming two of the Shah's children, the eldest was doing something very different. He was trying to build a future out of the wreckage. Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi had been 17 and training as a fighter pilot at an American air base in Texas when the revolution broke out, and he never went home. After his father's death in 1980, he held a small ceremony and declared himself the rightful Shah of Iran. He was 20 years old, a king with no kingdom, a title with nothing behind it. He settled in the Washington, D.C. suburbs, married a lawyer named Yasmin, raised 3 daughters, and for decades occupied a strange kind of political limbo, giving speeches, courting American policymakers, and largely being dismissed by serious observers as a relic of a system history had already replaced. Inside Iran, even mentioning his name favorably could get you arrested. And then, in the autumn of 2022, everything shifted. A 22-year-old woman named Mahsa Amini died in the custody of Iran's morality police after being detained for allegedly wearing her hijab incorrectly. Her death set off the largest wave of protest the Islamic Republic had faced since the revolution itself, spreading under the banner of woman, life, freedom, and in the middle of it, something unexpected happened. Protesters in the streets began chanting Reza Pahlavi's name, not necessarily because they wanted the monarchy restored, but because he had become, almost by default, the most recognizable face of opposition to a government they wanted gone. One independent poll, conducted around that time, surveying over 100 respondents inside Iran, found Pahlavi with the highest level of support among more than 30 potential figures to lead a transitional government. Though it's worth reflected one poll's methodology rather than a settled national consensus, and plenty of Iranians, especially on the left and other minority communities, remained deeply distrustful of him, wary of trading one authoritarian legacy for another. That distrust deepened in April of 2023, when Pahlavi made a public visit to Israel and met with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, a trip that drew sharp criticism even from Iranians who despised the Islamic Republic, many of whom felt it looked like aligning with a foreign power against their own country. The protests of 2022 eventually faded under a brutal government crackdown, and Reza Pahlavi went back to his strange, unresolved existence, more visible than he'd been in decades, but still, fundamentally, a man without a country. That unresolved existence hasn't stayed still, though. In the final weeks of 2025 and the opening weeks of 2026, waves of protest swept across Iran again, met by a government crackdown, by various human rights accounts, killed and imprisoned large numbers of demonstrators. Then, on February the 28th, 2026, the United States and Israel launched a joint military campaign against Iran in an operation reportedly code-named Epic Fury, striking military and government targets, and in its opening moves, killing Iran's supreme leader along with a number of senior commanders. Iran responded with waves of missile and drone strikes of its own against Israel, American forces in the region, and shipping in the Strait of Hormuz, and the fighting has continued in fits starts ever since, through cease-fractured and renewed rounds of strikes, with reporting as recent as this past week describing both a pause in attacks and ongoing uncertainty about whether real negotiations are even underway. Pahlavi has positioned himself directly in the middle of it, publicly describing the American and Israeli operation as a humanitarian intervention aimed at the regime rather than the Iranian people, and to what his organization calls the Iran Prosperity Project, a detailed blueprint covering everything from the economy to the security services, meant to guide the country through the first months after any collapse of the current government. He has also, by his own account, helped organize a campaign encouraging Iranian security personnel to defect, and has appeared at gatherings in the United States framing himself as ready to lead a transition. Whether any of that translates into him actually holding power, or whether it turns out to be an elaborate plan for a moment that never quite arrives, is genuinely unresolved as this is being written, and depends on decisions still being made in Tehran, Washington, and Jerusalem in real time. What does seem clear is that Empress Farah, now in her late 80s and dividing her time between the United States and Paris, has spent more than 4 decades watching her country's story get rewritten again and again, with her ever getting to go home. She has buried a husband, a son, a daughter, and a nephew. She has watched a modernizing monarchy give way to a theocracy, and that theocracy uniting for its survival against the very kind of foreign military intervention her husband's own downfall was shaped by decades earlier. The family's once vast fortune, estimated by various accounts to have run into the billions of dollars when the Shah was in power, was almost entirely seized or frozen after 1979. Farah's current financial situation is private and difficult to verify from the outside, though by most accounts it is a far more modest existence than her decades as empress would suggest. Step back far enough, and the Pahlavi story stops being just a family tragedy and starts looking like a case study in something bigger. What happens when a nation's fate gets decided, again and again, by outside powers rather than by the people who actually live there? A soldier backed by British officers crowns himself king. A CIA officer defies his own orders to keep a coup alive. A theocratic revolution consumes the family that came before it, executing the men who once served it and turning its palaces into museums of its own excess. And then, decades later, that same revolutionary government finds itself facing bombs from 2 of the very powers that installed the monarchy it overthrew in the first place. Every generation in this story inherited a crisis it didn't create, and then became, whether it meant to or not, the author of the next one. Even the man currently positioning himself as the alternative to the Islamic Republic built much of his political relevance on an alliance with a foreign government, the same pattern that helped doom his father 70 years earlier, which is either a sign that history really does repeat itself, or a sign that in Iran, foreign power has simply never stopped being part of the equation. And once you set the politics aside, that's really what makes the Pahlavi family's private losses land the way they do. Leila and Alireza didn't choose to be born into that inheritance. They didn't choose exile at 9 years old and 12 years old. They didn't choose to carry the weight of a dynasty's failures on their shoulders, and in the end, they didn't survive carrying it. Their story isn't really about palaces or crowns at all. It's about what happens to the people who are standing closest to history when it turns. The ones history barely bothers to name. Whether Reza Pahlavi ever becomes more than a name chanted in a protest crowd is still an open question, and it may stay open for a long time yet. But somewhere in Paris right now, a woman in her late 80s is living with the answer to a question most of us will never have to face. What's left of you after everything you were given at birth gets taken away, piece by piece, for the rest of your life? If this story stayed with you, let me know in the comments which member of this family's story hit you hardest, because I'm genuinely curious whether it's the fall of the Shah himself or the quieter losses that came after him. And if you want more deep dives into royal families that lost everything, subscribe, because there are a lot more stories like this one still to tell.